Part 2 of our look at the 1920s. Calvin Coolidge would serve as interim president after the death of Warren G. Harding, but is elected in his own right during the election of 1924. The political plank that Coolidge would run under was one that was very conservative in nature. He ran on a political position or a platform that insisted that European war debt owed to America must be paid back, and he supported a measure known as the Dawes Act, which claimed to do just that. He also ran on a decidedly more conservative plank than Harding did when it came to matters of trade. For example, he supported protectionist tariffs. And he also embraced more conservative social values. Like most Americans, Coolidge supported restrictions on immigration. He was in support of limited government and small federal budgets. The election of 1924 exposed some of the cultural splits that were apparent in 1920s America. So as we transition into the second era of the 1920s now, this is a very important split that needs to be investigated. Basically, when you're talking about 1920s America, you're talking about really two countries existing side by side. You had, on the one hand, your urban America, which represented modernity and new ideas. An America that, for example, didn't support immigration restrictions, didn't support prohibition, had more Catholics and also more Jews as a part of its fabric, was more racially and ethnically diverse, and politically included a coalition of big city Democrats and so-called free market Republicans who were more liberal on social issues. On the other hand, you had that stood in stark contrast to this particular version of America in the 1920s, rural America, which represented more traditional ideas. This was the America that supported immigration restrictions, supported prohibition, was far less diverse religiously, much more Protestant in nature. You know, your Baptists, Methodists, Lutherans, Presbyterians, and the like. They weren't nearly as nearly as diverse as urban America was. They were more homogeneous in nature. And politically, you had a coalition that included conservative rural Democrats, principally from the South, and conservative Western Republicans who were rather adverse to a large federal government presence in many aspects of American life. So the election of 1924 is going to amplify the divisions that existed in American society. Interestingly, however, it would be the Republican Party that would be the more unified party of the two major parties and was therefore in a better position to win the 1924 elections. The splits, however, in culture was more readily apparent in the Democratic Party. It was the Democratic Party that absorbed more of the political and cultural divisions present in the country at that time. The party attracted two very different base of supporters. On the one hand, you had the southern western wing of the party, represented by William G. McAdoo. He was a Georgia Democrat. If that name sounds familiar, you may recall he was Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law during Wilson's time in office and was responsible for instituting segregation in federal buildings in Washington, D.C. He was perceived to be the candidate of choice for the Ku Klux Klan and members of the Protestant Southern and Western community. He's going to stand in stark contrast to New York Governor Al Smith, an urbane liberal who didn't support prohibition. He was an Irish Catholic. And there are a couple of pictures here for you to use as a reference point for these two gentlemen. So a badly divided political party, a badly divided Democratic Party is going to select as its representative in the 1924 election neither McAdoo or Smith. The party is going to instead elect to go with a California lawyer by the name of John W. Davis, who is going to get trounced by Calvin Coolidge in the 1924 election. So Coolidge is going to go on to be the president of the United States in a term which would last from 1924 to 1928. The country over which Coolidge would preside can be best characterized by four cultural currents. And when people talk about the so-called Roaring Twenties, it's this part of the decade that they're likely referencing. The Roaring Twenties had four cultural currents present as a part of its fabric. You had the current of Nativism and Racism, you had religious fundamentalism, and then on the other hand, you had the New Negro movement as characterized by the Harlem Renaissance, and the so-called New Era as characterized by growing consumption and consumerism on the part of the American people. So we're going to take a look at all four of these currents in a little bit more detail. Start with the current of nativism and racism. The nativist movement represented the belief that traditional America and Americans were under attack because the country was being inundated with non-white, non-Protestant immigrants. The call was sounded to have more immigration restrictions placed on just who got to come into this country. And this particular call would lead to the establishment of the Johnson Immigration Act of 1924. This act would reduce immigration quotas to 2% of foreign-born nationals according to their representation in the census of 1890. Now, why would this law choose to go all the way back to a census that as of the passage of this law was 33 years old? Why the 1890 census? I mean, you had more recent censuses that were conducted in the years 1900, 1910, and 1920, but what was the point of going all the way back to the 1890 census? Well, most immigrants since the 1890 census came from southeastern European countries like Sicily, Italy, Greece, Poland, and Russia. So the census data of 1890 and before showed that most of your immigrants came from Northwest European countries like England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia. So in setting quotas based on what the population was represented according to the 1890 census, we see a law that is going to favor people of Northwestern European ancestry over any other European group. The law would exclude Asian immigration altogether. So Chinese, Japanese, Korean immigrants, they were banned from immigrating into the country. But interestingly, it allowed for the unlimited immigration of Western Hemispheric nationals, like Mexicans, for example, or Canadians for that matter. The restrictions that we saw put in place under laws like the Johnson Act were based on racial and ethnic assumptions popular during the day. We also are going to see a revised interest in the Ku Klux Klan, which of course was an organization first established in the wake of the Reconstruction era, in the wake of the Civil War era during the Reconstruction period of the 1860s and 70s. It is going to be revived or reborn in the year 1915 upon the release of a movie entitled The Birth of a Nation. This movie was probably one of the most racist movies ever produced and screened as a Hollywood production. It was based on a book called The Klansman, and in it would depict African Americans lawlessly roaming the countryside, terrorizing white women. It would go on to depict the Ku Klux Klan as avengers of white law and order. The movie had a profound effect on President Woodrow Wilson, who got a private screening of it while he was in the White House, calling it the most important movie ever to be made. He said that this movie was like having history written by lightning in the sky. And I have a link here embedded in the presentation that will go to a YouTube excerpt from The Birth of a Nation. If you're unable to access it, through this presentation, I will also make this same link available in the Canvas module that accompanies this lesson. That might actually be a better way to access it. The Klan would reach its peak in 1924. This will be the year that the organization would stage a 100,000 member march on Washington, D.C., which I have an image of on the very next screen. One of the ways in which the Klan expanded its reach and broadened its appeal was to include a message of pro-American, pro-Protestant moral values, and one that wasn't just solely anti-Black. Now, the group would expand its enemies list to include not just Black people, but Jewish people and Catholic people. The Ku Klux Klan, this new and improved version, would feature a women's group known as the Camilla, spelled with a K. Here are the membership stats. Surprisingly, most of the membership of the 1920s version of the Ku Klux Klan were concentrated in 3 states, none of which were southern states. Please take a note of that. If you look at what's going on in this screen, here you see that picture of the 24 Klan March that I referenced earlier, where 100,000 Klansmen and women descended upon Washington, D.C. in broad daylight with hoods off, marching down Pennsylvania Avenue as a demonstration of their popularity and power. So that's the current of Nativism and Racism embodied in 1920s Calvin Coolidge's America. The second strain that we mentioned earlier in the lecture had to do with religious fundamentalism. Fundamentalists were religious people who carried strict biblical interpretations of their faith. And one of the most representative figures of this strain of religious cultural expression in the 1920s was the gentleman whose image you see projected here. His name, and I'm not kidding you here, was William Ashley Sunday. So a preacher or a man who would grow up to be known as Reverend Sunday. I promise you that was not a marketing trick. That was his actual name. He's going to have a weekly radio broadcast show that is going to attract thousands of listeners nationwide. And aside from Billy Sunday and what he represented through his radio program, the apex of religious fundamentalism during the 1920s is going to be the Scopes monkey trial of 1925. Now, here is a piece of courtroom drama that could not have been scripted any better than even Shonda Rhimes could have imagined. The Scopes monkey trial was set in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925 and was a culmination of legal fights brought about by the passage of a Tennessee state law known as the Butler Act. The Butler Act, which was named for the legislator who sponsored it, who also happened to be a primitive Baptist preacher, outlawed or banned the teaching of evolution in Tennessee public schools. John T. Scopes, a 10th grade biology teacher in Tennessee, answered the ACLU's, the American Civil Liberties Union's challenge to purposely break this law. The ACLU volunteered to pay money for the defense of anyone accused of defying this law, because they saw this as a way to launch themselves into national prominence. They had, after all, been founded in 1919, and they saw themselves as a bulwark to sort of safeguard against what they felt was a rising tide of reactionary repression of free speech and political expression. So sure enough, Scopes, this biology teacher, is arrested. He's charged with violating the Butler Act for teaching evolution in his Tennessee classroom. And it's going to basically serve as a poignant example of the rural-urban split in 1920s America. One of the ways that it does that is featuring the two lead counsels for the opposing sides in this trial. On the one hand, you had Scopes' attorney, the ACLU representative here, as featured in the person of a man by the name of Clarence Darrow. Darrow was this urbane, liberal, ethnic Jew that was either an agnostic or an atheist. So he was everything that the good people of Dayton, Tennessee love to hate. And on the other hand, you had the school board attorney, a man who was actually a candidate for the U.S. presidency in the election of 1896, William Jennings Bryan, who himself was a product of rural, conservative, fundamentalist America. The judge was partial to the Butler Act, the initial judge who overheard testimony in this case, and as such did not admit scientific evidence into his courtroom. So the Scopes conviction was upheld in local courts, but would eventually be overturned in higher courts. The implications that the Scopes trial has in American history is, aside from it being a poignant example of the rural-urban split in 1920s America, it would also serve as something of an harbinger of things to come up to and including our own day and time, when we still have these debates over whether the teaching of evolution in public schools should even be allowed. A third current of the 1920s that was evident in American culture was the current of mass consumption, which ushers in a modern era of consumerism. Magazines and other publications of the era would refer to this part of the 20s as the new era. What we see with the new era and the advent of modern consumerism would actually be more or less an extension of World War era business-government cooperation that led to confidence in the ability of the American businessman to solve any economic problem. This attitude is going to result in the relaxation of antitrust and regulatory laws, and it's going to, among other things, spark an American love affair with consumption, probably best embodied by the love affair that we're going to have with consuming automobiles. I mean, our love affair with the car is born in the 1920s, and it was made much more possible. The attaining that automobile was made much more possible thanks to the availability of consumer credit, mass production of the car itself, and that last piece there, advertising. So now we've got a whole entire industry built on the proposition of convincing Americans that they actually do need to have the latest, the greatest, the nicest, the newest. And this is actually going to be something that is going to be a hallmark of American culture ever since. Just as we saw during the Gilded Age of the 1870s and 80s, business can once again do no wrong. In fact, Calvin Coolidge goes on record as having said that the business of America is business. He's iconic, the businessman is, and he can do no wrong. And in fact, there's even going to be nods to this attitude present in religious expression of the 1920s. You're going to see all kinds of books written that will link a admiration for capitalism with something that is correct in the expression of true Christianity. For example, there's actually a book that's going to be written in the 1920s that is going to extol the commercial value of following the Ten Commandments. So in other words, don't follow the Ten Commandments because it is the morally right thing to do. Follow the Ten Commandments because in so doing, it will make you more materially prosperous. Now, who do we have to thank for this advent of advertising and the establishment of consumerism that advertising is going to help to inspire? One of the people that we have to thank for that is this gentleman, Bruce Barton. He's often referred to as the father of modern advertising. He's the co-founder of one of the world's largest ad agencies, which is still in operation today on Madison Avenue in New York City, the B.D.&O. agency. In 1925, Barton wrote a book entitled The Man Nobody Knows. And it's actually, it kind of goes back to what I was saying on the previous slide about how commercial values are going to be intertwined with religious ones to sort of give a religious justification to the pursuit of materialism and capitalism, capitalist goals. So in this book, I've got an excerpt here that Barton wrote about Jesus. He said, Christ would be a national advertiser today, I am sure, as he was a great advertiser in his own day. He thought of his own life as a business. Well, let's think about that. I mean, Jesus certainly knew how to draw a crowd, did he not? You think about some of the miracles the Bible chronicles and the crowds that were attracted as a result. I mean, maybe Barton was on to something. So whether, you agree with the existence of Jesus or not, certainly the whole greater point of this is to demonstrate the link between consumerism, trying to link that to religious expression, kind of making it morally okay to pursue materialism and materialist goals and aims. The advertising of the day that Bruce Barton is going to, in essence, pioneer was pervasive, and it created a new spirit of consumerism and materialism in American culture. Advertising was used through the use of words and imagery to create needs, to generate a demand for various products that heretofore Americans didn't think they had a need for. I mean, like here, where I make the point where advertising of the day even created new words. If you go over to the next slide, halitosis is one of those words. How many of you knew that the word halitosis was actually invented in 1923 by Listerine as a marketing ploy to sell more mouthwash? Somehow convincing the American people to swish around a solution in your mouth that basically tastes like sour alcohol to combat bad breath. It wasn't enough to tell people that you've got bad breath, so you better use some Listerine. Oh no, you have something much more chronic than that. You've got halitosis. Dude, that sounds serious. You better get the potent power of Listerine on that. Well, when words weren't being invented, you had words being used and manipulated in order to, again, create a need or a demand for various products or the other. And they've actually done more recent research and studies that show that just by putting the words new and modern or new and improved on packaging, that sales actually go up of those products by as much as 30%, even if what's included in those products are neither new or improved. Here's some examples of 1920s era advertising. Let's look at this one. Well, there's our friend at Listerine here. And remember when I mentioned that the use of words and imagery combined to create a need or a demand. Look at what's going on here in this ad. You know, what we say about sex selling, that actually was true in the 1920s as well. I mean, here we have an attractive woman and she's being swept seemingly into the throes of ecstasy by this attractive man. And the question there says, "How's your breath today?" Well, the implication there is if your breath isn't so good, it might keep you from being, let's say, lucky in love, right? Remember halitosis. Look at this ad. The world's worst job ended by Kleenex. Well, what was the world's worst job? According to Kleenex, washing handkerchiefs. Yeah, I guess that would suck pretty bad if you had to wash somebody's snotty, booger-filled handkerchiefs. Doesn't sound like something I'd want to do. Unless, of course, well, do we even want to talk about what was used before the advent of these products? We all know what this is, especially my ladies out there. Do we even want to know, right? Maybe that's the world's worst job. I don't know. This new era of American consumerism also coincided with a new dawn in the age of celebrity. The 1920s is going to represent the first decade where mass media is going to help Americans cultivate their unending fascination with celebrities. Celebrities in every arena, in sports, in entertainment, particularly. I mean, we have, for example, in the 1920s, the first sports superstar in George Herman, also known as Babe Ruth, whose nickname was the Sultan of Swing. He's going to revolutionize the game of baseball by the amount of home runs, which, is going to be responsible for the nickname Sultan of Swing. He's the first major sports superstar to enjoy near ubiquitous endorsements of various products, everything from tobacco to soda pop. Mass media is going to usher in a new fascination with other celebrities. Some notable names from the 1920s include Rudolph Valentino and Gloria Swanson, widely believed to be the first so-called sex symbols in Hollywood. Amelia Earhart, of course, she's going to be notable for her ill-fated flight as she attempted to become the first woman to fly around the world before her plane mysteriously crashed somewhere over the Bermuda Triangle. There's Charles Lindbergh, who was the first American to successfully solo a flight across the Atlantic. He's going to receive a hero's welcome in New York City upon finishing that feat. In the 1920s, mass media is going to enjoy a, um, a real renaissance, not renaissance, but a real, are going to take real steps into its development. You've got the first commercially licensed radio station, KDKA, that takes to the airwaves in 1921. It's, to my knowledge, still on the air today as a public radio station. And the first so-called talkie, the first major motion Hollywood release, is going to hit the screens in the year 1927, The Jazz Singer. And talkies are movies that have simultaneous sound to them. So the era of the silent film is slowly going away as a result.